Such an honor to be here speaking MOCA. I rarely speak as a Chinese American. For some reason, I'm always speaking as a diasporic Hong Konger. But I mean, tonight, I feel very honored. And, we are talking about Kang Youwei, one of the major figures of early modern China. And people are saying, the challenge that Kang Youwei faced is still with us today. Uh, I guess in Chinese history book, Kang Youwei is most famously known for his 100 Days Reform. He was born in 1858 and died in 1927, and so he's best known for the 100 Days Reform. Reform, 务书变法, or say 败于为生, which was a failed 103 days reform in cultural, political, and educational system in China. It took place in 1898 in the summer. And most significantly is modern China or early modern China, that was still the imperial era, its first attempt at constitutional reform. Is from monarchy to constitutional monarchy, which has always been misunderstood. Him as, this conservative who just want a king, as an absolute monarchism. And for that reason, it's been smeared and until today, basically, because he took different stand on how to transform China vis-a-vis Dr. Sun Yat-sen. So now, but I mean, the event failed, but it was not forgotten. For example, there is this Charter of 8 in 2008, drafted and launched by a number of well-known Chinese intellectuals, including Liu Xiaobo, who is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And in that charter, the first paragraph said, "The shock of the Western impact upon China in the 19th century laid bare a decadent authoritarian system and marked the beginning of what is often called the greatest changes in thousands of years for China. The first attempt at modern political change came with the ill-fated summer of reforms in 1898, that is, Kang's reform. But these were cruelly crushed by ultra-conservatives at China's imperial court. So he was forced into exile with a price on his head for 16 years. And tonight's event actually was the book covering his time in exile. But I still want to talk a little bit more about Kang because of his unique vision. And he was known not only just for Chinese historians. For example, in this book called The Honor Code, written by Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is a professor of philosophy and law at NYU and the columnist for the ethicist at the New York Times. And in this book, he explored the worst, what he called moral revolutions, including the abolition of slavery. And Kang got a chapter in his book for his effort to unbind women's feet. So he started in 1883. He launched organization to try to unbind women's feet, which was a tradition, a very bad and ugly custom that existed for a millennium in China. So 10 centuries is no joke. For women's feet to be crushed in certain way to make it erotic or whatnot, So he began by unbinding his daughter's feet. And one of his best-known daughters is Kang Tongbi. We can see, okay, this is the book, The Honor Code, by Appiah. And yeah, very beautifully written. And not just about Kang, but the end of slavery, how that came about. So then, this beautiful woman, well, that was a picture from 1905. Actually, you can see the antique photo over there with his with her own name card in those days, so her own calligraphy. You can see that over there. And it was a lovely present given to me by Jane and Robert. Yeah, yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah. So Kang Tongbi came to study in the US. She was not the first Chinese woman student in the United States who came. I forgot her name. I think her name is up here somewhere in the exhibit. Yeah. So if you go upstairs, I remember I saw the picture of the first um, woman attending American college. Counterly came to the U.S. and then that picture was taken in Connecticut, yeah, when she was, staying with the host family. But then she came to Barnard in 1907 as its first Chinese student. And there was press coverage of her in those days, calling her a princess. I mean, she's like a royalty, and they call her a princess. But she became a pioneering suffragist in China. However, how people got to vote, I don't know in these days. But back then, for a period of time since the founding of the republic, there were elections being held, and Cantonville was one of the person who pushed for that to come about, to the extent that she was personally complimented by Mao Zedong at one time, even though that didn't help her very much. She died quite tragically during the Cultural Revolution. So there's the distinguished lineage of Kang Youwei, and what she has done for us. And I think one of the highlights we'll talk about, and I'll ask Jane about it. And I feel very honored and very happy to be seeing this book launch event tonight, because in a small way I was able to help bring it about. That's because in 1908 and 1909, I got a fellowship to study in Paris and stay for a month. And I was thinking maybe I make a film in Europe. And then at that time, Kang Youwei's Swedish journal. You mean he traveled? He was China's first grand traveler, you can say. I forgot how many countries, more than 30 countries, or he was. Yeah.
180,000 miles.
180,000 miles. That's what he said in those days. But I mean, I don't know how many countries it traveled. Remember, it was a period, the turn of the 20th century, when travel was not as easy or as today. But he did travel to places very far flung, uh, including Scandinavia. At times I wonder whether it's because assassins have been following him. Maybe part of the reason he had to go as far away as possible. So he went to Sweden and he kept a journal. I saw the journal, so okay, why don't I just make a nice travelogue about, turn of the century Sweden or something, hopefully it won't change too much, etc. Then I realized that in which he was talking about the death of his mentor, who introduced him to the emperor at the time in order to initiate the 100 Days Reform. And at that moment, I feel that no, I cannot not touch upon Chinese history. So I made a film with that as the inspiration, and also that's the inspiration, presumably, about his utopian tract, 大传说. He wrote the first, in modern Chinese history, the first utopian tract. And there's some reason to believe, because Sweden was one of the earliest country in the world to introduce a health welfare state. So maybe, but that's part of the reason. And in any case, he's exposed to Western literature, and he's a very original thinker. So he came up with that book, and so I made a film with Leung Qiji. Tonight I feel that I have to show him because he's a very well-known character actor in Hong Kong, and he died in 2022. So it's the first time I have a chance to talk about that on Kang Youwei and then my movie in a way. So this is it. This is Liao Qiji, and this is a scene with her. Presumably, my actress Lindsay is playing Kang Chongbi, the daughter. She's well in her life. I mean, she's a former ballerina. But then also Ben Ye, who played Lan Qiqiao, who also just passed a few months ago at the age of 43. So tonight is, is my memorial event for my actor as well. But the point is, because I was making that film, I started researching Kang, and then luckily I unearthed Robert's dissertation deposited at the Library of Congress. So I contact Robert, I want further material and then separately, since I want to make the film, the late scholar, Marxist historiographer of China, he's Marxist studying Chinese history. Arif Derlik, who also passed, he died a few years ago, referred me to Jane and asked me to interview Jane. And so I talked to Robert. I enjoy his dissertation very much. I said, why don't you update it and publish it? And then Robert was saying, oh no, I mean, it's a lot of updating. He needs somebody else to help him to update the book. And then, so I introduced Jane to get in touch with Robert. And together, they work on this project. And so I think at the time when I contact Robert, the dissertation was 20 years ago old, 20 or 30 years old.
72.
1972, yeah, that's when. I contact him like 2008, 2009, 2010 something. Yeah, so it was already 30 years old, and then now they spent another 20 years in completing this book. So there's half a century in making, and it's one of the few things that one can rejoice. Because so many unfinished projects in one's life, and it is a labor of love, on the part of both of them, and the dedication and interest in Chinese history. So yeah, I'm sorry, the event is about them and about the book, but I just have to make that detour. So I have to start asking some questions. First to Robert. Why did you pick that subject, and who did you work with at the time?
Well, I picked that subject for I picked that subject because I wasn't exactly looking for a dissertation topic, but during my master's degree work, I used a relatively new biography by Kang Youwei's grandson, Baohuanghui. And it was a book that had published Kang's own biography that existed at that time, and also gave an addendum to that based on his research. And he mentioned in there, I'd done a master's thesis on Kang Youwei. Actually, I'd done a bachelor's thesis on Kang Youwei. This really goes back to 1966. I did a bachelor's thesis on the conservative reaction to the 100 Days of Reform. Well, that bumped me right into Kang Youwei, of course. When I got to graduate school and I'm looking around for a thesis topic, and my mentor said, well, what did you work on? What's your bachelor's on Kang Youwei? I said, well, not exactly the sort. He said, why don't you look more Kang Youwei? And I did, and I wrote a master's thesis that kind of looked back at his intellectual development from childhood up to 1898. I didn't get into the later period. Well, Rung Bang Lo's excellent biography, which was new in those days, 1966 or 67, had a section on when Kang had come to North America after the failure of the 100 Days Reform. He was in exile. He had a price on his head. He basically fled to North America after being in Hong Kong briefly and Japan briefly. And he also got to Washington, D.C. Well, I've been doing some personal research at the National Archives and the Library of Congress during the summers. And I was wondering about this thing in Washington, D.C. because he had two meetings with no less than with Theodore Roosevelt at the White House. Well, that's kind of interesting. And I thought, with this, my sort of summertime, we'll do just for fun research, let me find more about that. And particularly in Rung Bang Lo's book, he mentioned he not only met with Roosevelt twice, but he wrote, I forget like a 20,000 word letter to him. And he not only, well, I later on discovered, no, it's just one letter. So I thought, gee, I'd like to find that letter. Because Rung Bang Lo didn't have that letter. He didn't really know anything about it except that it existed, that he wrote it. And so I started, well, I'll go to Library of Congress. Library of Congress has Theodore Roosevelt papers there. So that should be easy. Well, I didn't quite understand the bureaucracy of those days. If a letter is received by the President of the United States, what does he do? He's got staff out there called the United States government, the executive branch. So he sent it on to the State Department. The State Department got it. They said, well, this is a man who's sort of a revolutionary. We're not sure if we should let him in our country. He wanted to come visit. This goes back to an earlier period. This gets very complicated. I'm sorry. It's all in the book. Read the book. So I wanted to find that letter. It was not in the Roosevelt papers. It got forwarded on somewhere. They advised me at the library, go to the National Archives. I eventually found the letter. I know I found the letter, but I found this whole immigration file where the U.S. government tried valiantly to keep him out of the United States. And so this got to be a very thick file, hundreds and hundreds of pages. I then realized, well, this is a dissertation topic right here. And so that's kind of how they got started. So, I worked with some people at the Library of Congress in the initial research, and they had to send me off elsewhere. I worked with people in the National Archives. My mentor was Father Joseph Seavies, who had been a Jesuit missionary in China before the war, World War II, that is. He'd been there since the 1930s. He was incarcerated by the Japanese in Shanghai. And then when he finally left China, he went to Harvard, got himself a PhD, and he came to Georgetown. So he was very, very helpful to me. I also had consulted with Arthur Hummel, who was the director, the chief of the Asian division of the Library of Congress, and discovered that he had been a student of Leung Chi, who was a student of Kang Youwei. So we're just one generation away, just barely. And I thought, well, that was pretty interesting. And then my master's degree mentor, Leung had been a student in China in the 1920s, and he had served as the interpreter for Leung Chi. So I got this kind of nice connection. And now I get a dissertation topic that no one's really written about before. So those are the people I worked with, and that's kind of how I got started. And what else can I say? I think that answers the question.
Yeah, so when I contact you out of the blue 30 years later, how did you react?
Oh, well, I react the same way, I want to say, the same way I reacted. In 1983, I received a letter from a presumably very nice lady named Louise Leung Larson. And she wrote me a letter saying, don't you want to do something with this dissertation? Don't you want to publish? Now, this is 1972. Now, this is 1983. I'd gone off in many other directions with Chinese studies at my work at the Library of Congress. I was an employee of the Library of Congress. So I sent her a letter back finally saying, no, You must understand that the Leung Larson family are extremely persistent people. In 1995, now here's another, decade's gone by, I'm staffing a booth for the Library of Congress with the Association for Asian Studies. And this woman arrives at the booth and says, "Hi, I'm Jane Leung Larson." I said, "Oh, was that your mother that wrote me a letter 10 years ago?" And she says, "Well, don't you want to update your dissertation?" And I said, "No." And then Evan's already told his story. He gets in contact. Another 10 years, well, not quite 10 years goes by. And I said, "No." But then I began to think about it. Well, some other people could get involved. Because I really was off in other directions, didn't want to take on this big additional work. But somehow it happened. And really, we blame Evans, we blame Louise Leung Larson, we blame Jane Larson. And I suppose I have to blame my wife, who got me started in 1966 looking at Chinese studies stuff. How's that for an answer?
Okay, yeah, we will pursue that more later. So my question for Jane, I mean, Jane, you have a personal connection to Kang as such, not biological, but yes, intellectual, in terms of the intellectual lineage and American lineage. My question for you is actually, give us that as well as one of the milestone event in Chinese American history or Chinese history is the anti-American boycott 1905. It was quite unprecedented at the time. And can you tell us a bit more about how they came about and what happened? Yeah, but begin with your own biography.
So my biography, can you hear me properly? It really evolves out of my grandfather, Tom Leung, Tom Xiao in Mandarin. And he was a student of Kang's in Guangzhou. I mean, one of Kang's many, many accomplishments was organizing a kind of alternative university, in a sense, that taught a new form of Confucianism as a philosophy of reform or making possible reform, political reform in other ways. And he taught this in Guangzhou in the 1890s, and he blended in his knowledge of the West that he'd gained from reading translations of Western authors, politics, economics, even he also studied math and science, etc. And all of these things he taught along with his most distinguished student, Liang Shichao, who was a couple of years older than my grandfather. And in the 1890s, it was the time of political change. 1895 was when my grandfather was studying under him. He was supposed to get married in 1895, but his parents both died, and he had to go through 3 years of mourning, so much for that. His wife got 3 years reprieve, and he went to study with Kang. I don't know why he chose Kang, because it was an unusual choice. His Tom Leung's father was actually a metropolitan scholar at Jinshi, so he was a pretty prominent person himself. He came from a scholarly family, and it probably would have been expected that he would have gone on to a regular classical education. But no, he joined Kang, and this became, in a sense, his school, sort of a school of cadres, of political activists who learned and wrote with Kang. They wrote Confucius as a Reformer, which was a very controversial book, but it was a joint project. At any rate, at that point, Kang became involved in the 100 Days of Reform, and prior to that, in 1895, he went up to Beijing to take the metropolitan exams. He had pass the provincial exams. He wasn't that interested himself in classical education, but he felt he needed to do it. So he went up there in 1895, and that was when the Chinese had from the Chinese had signed this treaty with Japan, ending a war, the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which was very detrimental to China in terms of losing Taiwan, amongst other things, paying a huge indemnity. And Kang wanted the Qing government to reject this treaty, but it was basically too late. But there were many provincial examination candidates in Beijing at that point. And so one of the things he did, because he already had this whole agenda platform of reforms from educational, military, economic, political, and so on. And he was writing petitions to the emperor and so on, but that doesn't do too much good. So what he did was he sort of organized the examination candidates and had a big rally, outdoor rally that lasted about 3 days, and presented his petition, and even though it was never actually submitted to the emperor, it was publicized in newspapers, and he became sort of a thing, and was able to, and he passed his Jinshi exam, so he was able to directly memorialize the emperor instead of going through other people and so on. So he began to have more influence, and the emperor began to listen to his ideas. But my grandfather immigrated to Los Angeles in 1899. He became an herbalist along with other members of the Tong family. They were never trained in herbalism, but they learned it on the spot. And he joined his cousin, who had a very prominent Fu and Wing company of Dowager in September 1898. So I guess I should leave it here. And,
In 1905.
Next-
Now, Baohuanghui, the Exile, that's the flag. I mean, they came up with the flag, on top of the piano. That's the Baohuanghui. That's a Kang's organization. Came up with their own flag. Yeah.
do you want to speak about the flag?
Oh, very briefly, this is a modern reproduction, which we were pleased to have presented Jane and me some years ago in Victoria, British Columbia, in the building where the Baohuanghui had been established in 1899. It's been renovated beautifully. But Kang also, he wrote an anthem for the Baohuanghui, badges and pins and stationery. Personally, did all that kind of stuff. So the flag, I don't know if I remember, there's the 3 stars, there's in the different stripes, they stand for equality, education, and independence, and then also the grouping together of people, and one other. There's 3, the 3 stripes and the 3 stars. Anyway. You can read about it in great detail in this fine book. Kang, and they design little medals and stuff. It goes on and on. He personally got into many arcane things.
Yeah.
Anything else you want?
Yeah, but in that case, I think you should talk about Baohuanghui's really expensive global organizations. It's quite amazing.
About the whole, international.
Yeah.
How many chapters?
And yeah, then because of that, they were able to circulate news about what's happening in the U.S., etc., and that partly led to the 1905 boycott.
Okay, I don't. It's these are my co-authors, our co-authors.
Introduce them.
But I wanted to. I think maybe one way to talk about the chapters is to talk about the New York chapter. But the organization began officially in July 1899, and Kang immediately was writing charters. he was organizing, contacting people in the United States and elsewhere. People came from San Francisco, from Portland, from Seattle, up to Victoria and Vancouver, where he was living at the time, and then he sent people from Canada because British Columbia was a major center of the Baohuanghui, particularly Vancouver and Victoria and New Westminster, BC. And there were 55 chapters in Canada ultimately. 93 that we've been able to document in the United States, and in places like the Pacific Northwest, we haven't even identified all the places.
They are also in Africa.
And South Africa, and one in Europe, Liverpool.
Yeah.
And in Southeast Asia, of course, it was very active in Latin America. And Mexico was another focus of our book. There was someone different. There were 12 chapters there. Torreon in Coahuila state was the most active, and they had a number of activities. But in addition to just having an organization, they had women's organizations. They had a commercial corporation, which was enormous, and had banks, restaurants, which my grandfather was involved with. Newspapers were probably the most important part of the business empire, and one of them lasted until 1969. And a number of other business activities that were very significant. But they also had a military academy that started in Los Angeles, organized through this sort of, how would you put it? Homer Lee. A very unusual American who had no military experience, but a great deal of military intellectual strategy, I guess you'd put it that way. At any rate, he organized, there were a number of military academy branches to teach young Chinese men military skills, which Kang felt was greatly needed. And also calisthenics and discipline and proper dress.
There was also the intent of uprising back in China.
Yes, they organized a couple of uprisings, one of them in 1900 to rescue the emperor. They wanted to basically restore the emperor to his throne and remove the empress dowager.
In the sense of continuing the reform,
Yeah.
I mean, so you have to
that was the
remember
whole
that. I
point.
mean, because very often he was just thinking of being a monarchist, but I mean, there was a whole vision of a kind of parliamentary system. I mean, so his vision of China. Very different from Dr. Sun is an European system, constitutional monarchy like Britain, and whereas Dr. Sun is from the U.S., he wants an American system, without monarch, presidential system basically.
Yes, I mean a constitutional system with representative government.
But Kang wanted the emperor's head, the head of
Right, and he wanted it as a symbolic, a titular monarch, is what he ultimately called it in 1911. But in New York was a particularly active place for the Baohuanghui. It probably started around 1900, I'm not sure. They had this building on 79 Mott Street.
Yes.
And
Still there.
still there, totally remodeled. But it was at that point the Port Arthur restaurant and the Swing Key store were below. Port Arthur was owned by Chu Go, who was a member of the Baohuanghui, and I think he may have owned the whole building. I'm not sure. But they had a couple of floors. They had a school there, and let's see. That's the meeting room and some of the some of the leaders, and I was hoping that somebody would be here. Is anybody here who had relatives who were involved in this? Because one of the people who I was hoping would come is related to, maybe related to one of these folks. And then this was the school, these patriotic academies they were called, and they taught Chinese and sometimes English, again calisthenics often, and they were actually mostly co-ed schools. And so, you know, it was they also, another very important thing in New York was this newspaper. Um, and this is the Chinese Reform News, which ran from 1904 to 1937. And there are only copies of the 1904 edition left, and this is one of those copies. But you can see that they sort of went in for education about the lives. There's an illustration, a painting of George Washington sort of reading his family, I guess after the Revolution or something. And this was sort of a typical kind of thing they would include. And there were articles denouncing Sun Yat-sen, who was traveling in the U.S. at the time, and recruiting Baohuanghui members, because they had a really extensive organization, whereas Sun's organization was mostly secretive, but much less extensive in form. And they also announced news of all different chapters. You know, Toronto forms a chapter, you know, et cetera, et cetera. New chapter in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So often we have had to guess from a Chinese name which city it is. And this, we're still guessing, as a matter of fact. We're still finding new information. Yeah.
So what about the 1905?
Why don't you say something?
Yeah, 1905 anti-American program. I mean, I think, you know, but it's kind of complicated to talk about it. Isn't that a little background to it? You know, it has something to do with Chinese Exclusion Act. And, you know, it started with the Page Act that is in 1875, mainly barring Asian immigrants, but I mean mostly targeting Chinese women, and then of course it evolved into the Chinese Exclusion Act 1882. So I mean Chinese being ill-treated, etc. Right? And you take it from there.
Well, yes, and coming in 1904 and 5, there was a new treaty was going to be signed. It was going to kind of really tighten the screws on Chinese immigration. Again, it had already been screwed several times over. And as Kang started he finally got into the United States in 1905, worked his way down the West Coast, spent some time in Los Angeles. And there were things coming to a head about that. He not only, didn't move totally on, he moved on somewhat from constitutional monarchy as his thing to the ill treatment of Chinese in America, especially the United States, Canada too, Mexico too. And the idea that there's this new treaty that was being negotiated between the U.S. and China. China was still a very weak country. And he began to suggest, more than suggest, we need to oppose this. And we oppose this by boycotting American goods in China. And it worked. They really got the steam up. And this upset a lot of the American entrepreneurs. Of course, we can't sell our products to China. They don't buy them right now. So it became a serious thing. When Kang finally got to the White House, this is the topic of conversation. We're doing this because your people treat our people very badly when they try to come to the United States, either as visitors or family, and he himself was not mistreated physically, but he had a hard time getting into this country. And so they did develop this boycott. It had some effect. In fact, Roosevelt himself said the very next day he issued an executive order. You all hear about executive orders these days, that the Bureau of Immigration needs to cool on how they're treating Chinese people coming and going in the United States. And one of the shocking things I think kind of shocking, we learned in writing about our book, reading book, is that they did have this uprising in 1900. They came up with money. They had army. He had Kang and his followers had an army in China. The thing failed. But around the same time, this Kang's an equal opportunity kind of guy. They brought us a woman student who was already a little notorious in China, having one the first woman to really give a very big public speech in China. They brought her to the United States for further education, but they also wanted her to train, unbelievable, I think, to become an assassin and go back to China with her now fluent English and her new cultural ways. The Empress Dowager loved things. She began to love foreign things and liked to have foreigners come. And she was going to get into a lady in waiting or whatever is the plan, when it all fell through. But the idea that they would fund this woman to come here and train to be an assassin was quite incredible. The other incredible person was his daughter, Kang Youwei. She was in Connecticut and traveled. She traveled a lot in 1905 with her father. They were into the Colt gun factory. He needed firearms. He was afraid Sun Yat-sen was going to assassinate him. They wanted to assassinate Sun Yat-sen, the Baohuanghui people. This has not been written about before, but we uncovered a huge amount of documents in an attic in Connecticut twice. Read about it. It's an incredible story. You can download this book for free. You don't have to buy the book. You can download a PDF for free. So we can give you information about that. But when they went to the whole gun factory, and Kang Youwei was offered a chance, would you like to fire a machine gun? And she says, of course. And she did. And the newspaper report, they were incredulous that this woman, and she's fairly small, like my wife's size. Did you ever fire a machine gun? No. Anyway, she fired a machine gun. She hit the target every time. They were amazed. Kang bought body armor. He bought weapons and so forth. That's an incredible story that's not been told until now.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll open up the floor, whatever questions you have.
Yeah.
Yes.
Running the mic for the recording. Thank you for your presentations. This is quite fascinating. So obviously the question is more about this issue about the difference between the two movements, Sun Yat-sen and Kang Youwei, and the question of the constitutional monarchy, I guess, is fundamentally maybe possible also with the British model, but also with the Japanese model, where they saw the Japanese develop and they say, hey, let's follow the same model. So I was wondering your understanding of why the constitutional monarchy has played a big role in their thinking as opposed to the Republican model, and what the differences were, and why one was more attractive than the other. Ultimately, why did Sun Yat-sen ultimately won in this process? And also, you want to talk about the interwar period, what role they played, Kang Youwei's movement played during the Japanese invasion, if they played any role.
Okay, so is that 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah, which one? Both of them. 31 and 37.
Okay, well, let's talk about constitutional monarchy.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
One thing about Kang, he did envision constitutional monarchy, the monarchy state. That's going to transition from the traditional monarchy of thousands of years in China. Now it's constitutional monarchy. People would vote. People would be citizens of the country. This hadn't happened before. But that wasn't his ultimate vision. His ultimate vision was a democracy. I think with a president eventually, they would move away from a monarchical form to this utopia. He wrote this book, Shu. It was to be a worldwide utopia. It's going to be one language for everybody. He's quite an incredible guy. And I think it's because of the traditional, he recommended these forms be able to claim them, and then they got all rescinded. It's a slow movement. Now, when you get to around 1908, you all know what happened, or maybe you don't. The Empress Dowager is very ill. The Emperor was not very ill, but lo and behold, the Emperor died, they think, from poisoning or whatever they find inside him. She died the next day. She wanted to get rid of him. And And guess who sent telegrams to the White House about all this? Our friend Kang Youwei. There's a whole series of telegrams. He said, "You got to save the emperor. You got to send troops, and you got to do something." Well, it was all too late by then, and they followed with more telegrams and more long letters. So they had that long correspondence. I think. Did you have a second question within all that?
Yeah, well, how did the movement transpire in terms of the invasion, the World War II period? Did they participate in the battles, or did they participate in the fight for independence against Japanese imperialism? Did they play that role?
No, I don't know anything about that.
Okay, but I'm just curious.
I
I don't think so.
No, that's beyond our period.
Okay.
I mean, Kang was deceased by that. Leung was deceased by then. His followers, but many of his followers, until the revolution. When the revolution came along, many of those pro-monarchy people. So now we have a new form of government. It's more like the West. This is more. And it's not like Japan now. At this point, they have a presidential system. So, yeah, I think they became loyal to the Republic of China.
I can mention, and actually it sort of relates to one of the people who's here today. Really, in Exile, there was a movement that did continue on. For example, the newspaper Shiji Ribao, which was the World Journal, which was not probably the one you're familiar with, but one that ended in 1969, I think. But it was led by various people, including a man by the name of Li Daming, I think, Li Daiming. And there was a movement in the 40s and 50s during the Cold War, really. After 49, the whole idea of this movement was a third force, a third way. I wish Charlotte Brooks had wrote a book about this called Between Mao and McCarthy. And she was going to be here, but she was unable to make it. But it talks about the sort of transition of the Baohuanghui, the Protect the Emperor Society, and they did change their name to Xianzhanghui, or the Constitutional Society, in 1908. But it became sort of a party after that, and it remained in the United States in the form of certain diehards, in a sense, including this Li Daming in San Francisco, who they opposed both the communists and the nationalists. And they wanted to have the president be Li Zongren, who was the grandfather of Leslie Lee right here, who was at one point the vice president of China and then became acting president, is that right? And then moved to, he was basically not a Chiang Kai-shek person, and he moved to the United States, and there was for a while a movement on the part of this sort of revivified reform organization to make him, for the U.S. to recognize him as the leader of China. And, of course it didn't work. And we ended up recognizing Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist China. But, it didn't die totally. I mean, in fact, in terms of the organization, many of the institutions lasted far longer than the sort of really active party, which, after the revolution, the 1911 revolution, pretty much died out, except for the newspapers that remained. And this one in San Francisco was a very independent voice, apparently.
And we'll get, just to add to that question, we'll take yours. I had the great good fortune, talk about having died yet, in 1970, I was able to interview through a son, a Baohuanghui member who was in Baltimore in 1905. We met Kang Youwei. He was still living at that point. I was able to track him down, and through a series of correspondence with his son, they gave him questions he answered. So, what's your question?
Can you give us a sense of the kind of influence and support that Baohuanghui had inside China leading up to 1911?
Well, it's a good question, and this is Miling Cui, who's one of our translators. Thank you. Well, I don't know how in terms of numbers what it was, but there was a great deal of influence in terms of the newspapers. For example, this newspaper in Shanghai, Shibao Eastern Times, which was founded initially by Leung and became very influential in the 1905 boycott and subsequent movements. Very influential. In fact, they probably were the reason why the boycott started. But there was, of course, this constitutional reform within China itself. The Empress Dowager realized that there had to be changes made. And so they were going to slowly have this constitutional preparation period. But it was very slow. and there was a lot of agitation, a lot of petitions from Kang and the overseas groups as well as within China, both within the court to some extent, amongst some of the royalty, Prince Pulun and some of the others, as well as a lot of the reformers within China. But in 1909, the first provincial assemblies took place. And so there were actually elections. A lot of people, very few people could vote, of course, who were eligible to vote. But a lot of those people elected were these reformers who had been sort of brought up on Kang Youwei's and Leung Chiqiu's ideology in a sense. And so they were quite prepared. And they were really mostly interested in national issues rather than provincial issues. And there was also in 1910, what was called the Zhezhengyuan, or the Political Consultative Congress, which was half court appointed and half elected from the provincial assembly people. And those people turned out to be very strongly in favor of a constitutional monarchy and hastening things. I mean, Kang was trying to initially get a constitution that would be decided not by the court, the royalty, imperial court, but by this Zhezhengyuan, this semi-elected, not exactly parliament, but consultative, like the whatever it is, a political consultative council of today or something, I suppose, but actually much more vocal and opinionated. And so he wanted, a constitution as early as, he wanted a real parliament as early as 1910 and then 1911, and then it was too late.
Was there a prototype of a constitution?
A prototype of
Outlined by Kang Youwei.
No trouble.
Well, I'm not sure if there was a prototype of a constitution. Well, they had a lot of principles. They did have principles, that they wanted. In 1911, actually, a lot of this was proposed and put across. A lot of this was, in writing, but not actually implemented.
Thank you. I'm really interested in if there's cultural roots in China, not just Western constitution, that drove this and drove the Empress Dowager to want to change. And with all the kind of, I want a constitutional monarchy or whatever, is there anything in Chinese culture that goes deeper than seeing other countries do it?
How would you?
Okay.
Well, I think over time during dynastic change, there was always we want to get rid of the old system and have something new. And if you look at the cyclical period, cycles of Chinese dynasties change. I think there's certainly yes in there, but still is all about having a monarchy with more representative of my people now, whoever defeated the previous dynasty. So, and Kang went back, and one of the things, he went back into that ancient literature to see what Confucius really was a reformer. That was one of his big points. That shocked people. So there's these concepts do go back and deep into Chinese culture. He himself is a deep intellectual Chinese culture. So, and then they saw what's happening in Japan, knowing how Japan modernized so quickly and so efficiently, and defeated China in one of its first wars. And then a few months later, they defeated the Russians. That's the way to go, maybe.
Let me respond to that briefly. Well, I think I think like Western democracy is supposed to be an important human invention, isn't it? Do you think that we shouldn't have it because it's not from your own culture? Should we use electricity? I mean, I think certain cultural forms are, I think, universal, but Kang's vision of his Daotongshu, that utopia has some roots in Chinese culture, in that kind of communistic vision. I did not go into that, but I feel that I should bring that up because with Kang, the one of the most astounding aspect of Daotongshu that I find, really transcends all culture was he's the one who first proposed same-sex domestic partnership in 1902, as an official institution. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. Why would he come up with that? But that was because his vision of the future, that things will not be realized. So things can be realized. Now he's not queer, he has several wives. But I think the late Qing culture is different. I mean, many cultures talk about how all the sanctioning of ambiguity, sexual ambiguity is more streamlined during industrial era. Mainly because that he still retained that old culture. So he was saying that in Datong, in a chapter called Punishment Discarded, he already knew that Socrates had homosexual inclination, but he was talking about abolishing marriage, abolishing so it's the Marxist underpinning, the sense that he felt that marriage is enslaving woman. So, there shouldn't be marriage. So instead, he came up with the idea that everybody should just enter domestic partnership.
For 1 year.
So even if you're a man and woman, you shouldn't get married. You should register domestic partners, and only for 1 year. After 1 year later, it will be automatically dissolved. And if you are in love, you want to be together, register again. Like visa or like voting, then like that. So finally, he feels that at the time he in this chapter he said that, even same-sex marriage is same-sex love is the equivalent of heterosexual love, and because in the future world, he was projecting the future, everybody will be free. Everybody will be independent. So whether you are interested in same-sex partner or opposite-sex partner, go to the marriage registry and get a certificate. So that's 1902 when he was writing about it. And the first domestic partnership we have today was in Denmark in 1989. So, and finally, when domestic partnership was established in France, I think it's the heterosexual who like to use it more than the gays. So this is something that I find it very interesting and amusing from Daotongshu, even though the racial politics in it has been attacked. Yeah. Okay. So, any more questions?
Okay. Do you want me to ask one? I guess a lot of his philosophy was trying to build reform within China, but what was its real impact on, I guess, the Chinese American community here in the United States? I see that he has so many branches in different cities and around. So how many, how large was the Baohuanghui here in the United States?
It was very. The Baohuanghui United States had how many chapters, Shane?
93.
93 chapters. He went to every major city in the United States, more or less. He went to a lot of those small towns and mining communities and farming communities in the West and elsewhere. He went everywhere. And I think the perception here, these are pretty much laboring people. Now, there's some merchants, smart people who are more well-to-do. They're the elite of the Chinatowns. But here's this man that appears who's been in the press. He's got some issues with the Chinese government that want to do away with him. But here he's this literate, very literate man, a very attractive man, dressed in traditional garb, coming to Chinatowns, and he's a celebrity. And here's a man from China who had met the emperor, is talking to me, the cook in the bottle washer in a Chinese restaurant maybe, and treating me like a good citizen, which is what he wanted to do. He had a tremendous impact, I think, on the that working class of people. No wonder they supported him. Sun Yat-sen was less successful doing that for a long time than that. There was a shift. So he was perceived quite well. The American press loved it. The American press will love anything that's new. And here's somebody he's exotic. He's got this beautiful daughter who can fire a machine gun. These kind of things. So he's very attractive in the Chinatown communities, and it makes fun. He spent a lot of time here in New York City. It's all in the book.
I think, in terms of the fact that he was able to put together this organization, because of course it was native place organizations, based on where you were from, secret society groups, that sort of thing. So this was a voluntary political organization. And, the ethic, in a sense, was unity, let's stop fighting amongst ourselves was one thing. And then, of course, creating this idea of a nation, because, it was the great Qing Empire, and he wanted to call it Zhonghua, China, which was very scandalous in itself to the Qing government. But, he saw, he felt that Chinese needed to organize, basically, in order to have any impact. And he saw the organization within American society, and so did Tung-Bi.
Just last follow-up question. What personal impact did he have on your family, Jade? And you're following up 3 generations later.
Yeah.
Like, why was he so influential in your family?
Well, I mean, it wasn't really me. Okay. The reason why is really my parents. My parents were both reporters. My mother was the Chinese part of the family, born in the United States in Los Angeles. My father was, half daughters of the American Revolution through his mother, and his father was a Swedish immigrant. And they were both reporters in the 20s and 30s. And my father particularly saw the value of history. And their marriage, of course, was something that my grandfather never heard about, in fact, even though Kang really believed in mixed marriages, particularly between whites and Asians, because he was sort of a eugenicist as well. He wanted to have like one race ultimately, but my mother was, sure that her father would never be able to endure the idea of her marrying an American, a white man. But it happened in any case, and he died, and he never found out about it. I'm sorry. And my grandmother accepted my father into the family, and my father immediately began working on a book, basically, gathering oral histories from the family members, including my grandmother. So my mother, attempted to translate everything, her Chinese was not very good. And so all these stories about Kang and about the assassins, Xie Jinqin, who was actually my mother's nursemaid in Los Angeles, and my grandfather helped support her. She lived with their family. And so he also, he wanted to write a book, he never did. And my mother ultimately, he died. But before that happened, in the 50s, my grandmother was still alive, but she had a number of strokes. And it was a large family home they lived in that Tom Leung had built in a fancy area of LA in 1914 when he built it. But the sons who lived with the mother all dispersed, built their own homes in Los Angeles, moved out, and they left many things behind. Things they couldn't understand, things in Chinese, including all of these letters and all of these papers. Well, my father and mother were long divorced by that point. And my father knew about the fact that the house had been broken into, it was now in a slum area. And he went there and he took all of these items, as much as he could carry, and he donated them to the Southwest Museum in Pasadena, which was an American Indian museum. And then when he died, my mother went to the museum, the Southwest Museum, got all the materials, and happened to, have all of these scrapbooks filled with these letters pasted in there, and a lot of loose letters. And one of the family friends was Perry Leung, who was a UCLA professor of Chinese, very famous now for being involved with dissidents. And he recognized the value of it. And so he basically indexed the letters, and my mother donated them to the UCLA Asian Library. They were all copied. And my mother asked me to have them translated. I couldn't translate them myself, of course, by a professor where I was living in Portland. And he, slowly these were translated while my mother was writing a book about the family using my father's materials and her own memories. But so that's basically, I got involved through the translation. I found out about the dissertation from someone I met in Portland, Oregon. I worked in China organizations I was interested in that part of my life.